My name is Dorothy. I'm 73 years old, and for the last 6 years my own children have been slipping $10 bills into my purse when they think I'm not looking, paying for my groceries in front of strangers like I'm a charity case, and talking about me in hushed voices like I'm some pitiful old woman who lost everything when my husband died. What they didn't know, sitting in that lawyer's office 3 weeks ago, was that I had let them believe a lie for 6 straight years, and I had done it on purpose. By the time that lawyer finished reading, 2 of my children weren't speaking to me, and the third was crying so hard she couldn't stand up. Let me tell you exactly how I got there, and why I don't regret a single moment of it. I need to take you back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense without understanding who my husband Walter was and what kind of man he turned out to be in the end, which honestly surprised even me. Walter and I were married for 41 years. He was a quiet man, an engineer by trade, the kind of person who fixed things around the house himself rather than calling someone, who drove the same truck for 15 years because it still runs fine. Dorothy, why would I replace something that works? People who knew us casually assumed we were comfortable but unremarkable, a retired engineer and his wife living in a modest brick house in a modest neighborhood, clipping coupons, taking one vacation a year to visit Walter's brother in Florida. That's what everyone believed, including, for a very long time, our 3 children. What nobody knew, what Walter kept almost entirely to himself for over 3 decades, was that he had been quietly investing since the early 80s, a little money here, a little money there, mostly in companies he understood from his engineering work, technology firms before anyone called them that, certain manufacturing patents he'd helped develop, and retained partial rights to through clever contract negotiations most people wouldn't have thought to push for. Walter never bragged. Walter never even really talked about it with me in detail, just handed me statements once a year and said, "We're doing fine, Dorothy, don't worry about the numbers." I trusted him completely, the way you trust someone after 4 decades of marriage, and I genuinely didn't pay close attention to exactly how fine actually was. When Walter passed 6 years ago, sudden stroke, gone within 2 days, I was so consumed by grief that handling our finances felt like wading through fog. Our oldest son, Brian, offered to help me get my affairs in order, and being exhausted and heartbroken, I let him. I let him sit down with our accountant. I let him review statements I barely glanced at myself. And somewhere in that process, something happened that I didn't fully understand until much later, something that changed the entire trajectory of my relationship with my own children. Brian came to me about a month after the funeral, sitting across from me at my kitchen table, looking appropriately somber, and said, "Mom, I went through everything with the accountant. I have to be honest with you, things aren't as good as we hoped. Dad had some investments that didn't pan out the way he expected, some bad timing with the market, some loans I didn't even know about. After the funeral expenses and the medical bills from his hospital stay, you're going to need to be really careful financially going forward." I remember sitting there, stunned, grieving, completely unequipped to question what my own son was telling me. I asked him, "Brian, am I going to be okay? Can I stay in the house?" He patted my hand and said, "You'll be okay if you're careful, Mom. The house is paid off, that's something, but there's not much beyond that. I think we need to start thinking about whether you might eventually need to downsize, maybe move somewhere smaller, somewhere more affordable to maintain." I believed him, completely, entirely, without question, because grief makes you trust the people closest to you even more than usual, and because Brian had always been the responsible one, the one who became a financial advisor himself, the one everyone in the family deferred to about money matters. Why would I doubt my own son about my own husband's finances? For the first year after Walter passed, I lived carefully, watching every dollar, clipping coupons more seriously than I ever had even during our leanest early years of marriage. My daughter Carol started bringing over groceries just to help out. Mom, don't worry about it. My youngest son Tommy started insisting on paying whenever we went out to eat, always with this slightly pitying look that made my stomach turn, though I told myself I was being too sensitive, too proud. But here's where things started feeling strange to me, strange enough that a small, quiet suspicion began forming somewhere in the back of my mind, even though I couldn't have told you exactly what I was suspicious of. About 8 months after Walter died, I went looking for an old photo album in our home office, the room Walter used as his study for 30 years, and I found a folder I didn't recognize tucked behind some old tax documents. Inside were statements, recent statements, from an investment account I had never seen before, with a balance that made me sit down hard in Walter's old desk chair. The account was substantial, not life-changing wealthy by some standards, but absolutely nowhere near the picture of financial struggle Brian had painted for me. I sat there for a long time, staring at those numbers, trying to understand what I was looking at. Had Walter hidden this account from Brian during the estate process? Had Brian simply missed it? Or, and this thought made me genuinely sick to my stomach, had Brian known about this account and deliberately not told me? I want to be very honest with you about what I did next, because I think it's the part of this story that surprises people most. I didn't confront Brian immediately. I didn't call a family meeting demanding answers. Instead, I quietly photocopied those statements, put the originals back exactly where I found them, and made an appointment with a different financial advisor, someone with absolutely no connection to my family, someone in a town 40 minutes away where nobody knew me as Walter's widow or Brian's mother. That advisor's name was Richard Hale, and the meeting I had with him changed everything I understood about my own life. Richard reviewed the documents I brought him, made some calls with my permission to verify account histories, and after about 2 hours of careful work, he sat back in his chair and looked at me with an expression somewhere between confusion and concern. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "I'm not sure how to tell you this delicately, but based on what I'm seeing here, your husband left you significantly more than what you've described to me. Between this investment account, 2 patent royalty streams that are still actively generating income, and a separate retirement account that appears to have been completely overlooked in whatever estate process your son conducted, you're sitting on assets worth well over $2 million. I remember the room actually seeming to tilt slightly when he said that number. $2 million. I had been clipping coupons, accepting petty groceries from my children, worrying about whether I could afford my heating bill that winter, while sitting on $2 million I didn't even know existed. I asked Richard the question that had been eating at me since I found that folder. How could my son have missed this during the estate process? He's a financial advisor himself. He should have caught this. Richard was quiet for a moment before answering carefully. "Mrs. Whitfield, I don't want to speculate about your son's intentions without more information. It's possible these accounts simply weren't disclosed during whatever process he conducted. Perhaps your husband kept them deliberately separate from accounts he typically discussed with family. But I'll say this. An account of this size, with this kind of paper trail, is not the sort of thing an experienced financial advisor accidentally overlooks." That sentence sat with me for days, weeks even, turning over and over in my mind like a stone I couldn't stop touching. Was my own son capable of deliberately hiding my husband's wealth from me? For what purpose? What could Brian possibly gain from convincing his grieving mother that she was financially struggling when she wasn't? I didn't have answers yet, but I made a decision that would shape the next 6 years of my life. I decided not to confront anyone. I decided, instead, to watch carefully and quietly, and let my family show me exactly who they really were when they believed I had nothing left to offer them. This is the part of the story where I imagine some of you watching might judge me a little, might think I should have simply confronted Brian immediately and demanded the truth. But I had lived 70 years by that point, and I had learned something important about human nature. People tell you who they are through actions far more honestly than they ever will through words, especially when they think nobody important is watching. So I continued living modestly, allowing my children to believe I was struggling, while quietly, through Richard, consolidating and properly managing the wealth Walter had actually left behind. And over those 6 years, I watched my family reveal themselves in ways that broke my heart, piece by piece. Carol, my daughter, started subtly pulling away once she believed I had nothing substantial to offer. Visits that used to be weekly became monthly, then occasional, always with some excuse about how busy life had gotten with her own kids. When I mentioned once gently that I missed seeing my grandchildren more often, Carol said something that I still remember word for word. "Mom, it's just hard, you know, with everything going on. We're trying to save for Madison's college fund. Every weekend matters for work. It's not like there's extra time for just visiting." Extra time for just visiting, as though spending time with me had become a luxury they could no longer afford, now that I supposedly had nothing material to offer in return. Tommy, my youngest, handled it differently but in some ways more painfully. He started avoiding conversations about the future entirely. Where he used to ask my opinion about decisions, career changes, whether he should propose to his girlfriend, he stopped including me in those conversations almost completely. I overheard him once on the phone with his girlfriend, not realizing I was in the next room, saying, "I mean, Mom doesn't really have much to offer in terms of advice anymore. She's dealing with her own stuff, you know, financially and everything. I don't want to burden her." I wasn't a burden to spare. I had simply become, in my children's eyes, a woman whose perspective and presence mattered less because they believed she had nothing left to give. But Brian was the one whose behavior cut deepest, because Brian was the one I now suspected of orchestrating this entire deception in the first place. Over those 6 years, Brian made several major life decisions: a new house, a significant investment in his own financial advisory practice, private school for his children, decisions that, looking at his actual income, seemed financially aggressive, almost suspicious in their timing and scale. I want to share with you the moment everything finally crystallized, the moment I understood, with complete certainty, exactly what had happened and why. About 4 years after Walter passed, I was helping Brian's wife, Janet, organize some files in their home office while babysitting their kids for a weekend. I wasn't snooping, I genuinely wasn't. I was simply looking for printer paper in a desk drawer when I found something that made my hands go cold. A bank statement, Brian's personal account, showing a transfer 4 years earlier, right around the time of Walter's estate process, for an amount that exactly matched, almost to the dollar, the value of that hidden retirement account Richard had discovered. My son had not simply overlooked that account during the estate process. My son had found it, transferred a significant portion of it into his own accounts, and then told his grieving mother that her husband had left her financially struggling. I sat in that home office for a long time, Janet's voice calling for me from another room, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might be sick. This wasn't carelessness. This wasn't an honest mistake made during a difficult time. This was theft, calculated theft, from his own mother, during the worst grief of her life. I didn't confront Brian that day, or even that month. I needed time to think clearly, to plan, because rage alone makes terrible decisions, and I wanted whatever I eventually did to be deliberate, not reactive. I spent the next 2 years quietly building an airtight legal case with Richard's help and a lawyer he recommended, a sharp, careful woman named Susan Reyes, gathering every document, every statement, every piece of evidence that demonstrated exactly what Brian had done. During those 2 years, I continued playing the part my family expected of me, the slightly struggling widow, grateful for small kindnesses, never asking too many questions, never revealing what I knew. It was during this period that the first major twist of this story revealed itself, something I genuinely did not see coming, something that complicated everything I thought I understood about my family. Carol called me one evening, voice shaking, asking if she could come over to talk privately. When she arrived, she sat across from me at my kitchen table, the same table where Brian had once told me his lies, and she started crying almost immediately. "Mom, I need to tell you something, and I should have told you years ago, and I'm so ashamed I didn't." My heart started racing, wondering what new betrayal I was about to learn. "About 4 years ago," Carol said, "Ryan came to me, told me he'd found some additional accounts of Dad's that weren't disclosed properly, and he said he was going to handle moving the money somewhere safer, said the accounts had legal complications and it would be easier to manage everything quietly without involving you while you were still grieving so heavily. He offered to share some of it with me and Tommy too, said it was only fair since we'd inherit it eventually anyway, said you'd never even know the difference since you didn't understand the accounts existed in the first place." I sat there, absolutely stunned, processing this new layer of betrayal. "Did you take money from him, Carol?" She nodded, crying harder now. "About $40,000. Over those 4 years, small amounts here and there that he said came from those accounts. I told myself it was fine because you didn't seem to need it, because Brian said it was complicated and you'd be confused by the legal details. I knew it was wrong, Mom. I think some part of me always knew it was wrong, but I let myself believe his version because it was easier than asking hard questions." This was the second major twist, more painful in some ways than discovering Brian's original theft, because it meant the betrayal had spread, had infected another one of my children, had become a small family conspiracy built on the assumption that a grieving widow wouldn't notice or wouldn't understand enough to fight back. I asked Carol the question that mattered most. "Why are you telling me this now, after all these years?" She wiped her eyes and said, "Because last week Tommy mentioned he'd never received any money from Brian about those accounts, and when I brought it up to Brian privately, he got defensive, told me to never mention it again, said if I said anything to you or Tommy, he'd make sure I regretted it." "Mom, that scared me. That's not how Brian used to talk to me. I think this has changed him, this secret, this money." I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine anymore. So now I understood something crucial. Tommy had received nothing, had no knowledge of any of this, while Brian had stolen from me directly and shared a portion with Carol to buy her silence and complicity, then threatened her when the arrangement started feeling unstable. I told Carol everything I had discovered over the previous 2 years, every account, every transfer, the full scope of Brian's deception. I watched her face shift from shame to genuine shock as she realized just how much larger this betrayal actually was than the relatively small amount she'd personally been involved with. "Mom," she said quietly, "what are you going to do?" I told her the truth. "I'm going to finish what I've already started." The third twist came just 2 weeks before everything finally came to its conclusion, and this one came from a source I genuinely never anticipated: Brian's own wife, Janet. Janet called me, voice tight with controlled anger, asking to meet me privately at a coffee shop instead of either of our homes. When we sat down, she got straight to the point in a way that surprised me, given how reserved she'd always seemed throughout their marriage. "Dorothy, I found out 2 days ago, completely by accident, what Brian did with your husband's accounts. I confronted him, and he admitted everything, including admitting that he's been planning to liquidate a significant portion of those funds within the next month for a business expansion he hasn't told me the full truth about either. I think he's scared, Dorothy. I think he knows, on some level, that this is going to come out eventually, and I think he's trying to move the money somewhere harder to trace before that happens." This was the third twist, the urgency suddenly becoming critical. Brian wasn't simply sitting comfortably on stolen money. He was actively preparing to hide it further, possibly preparing for the exact moment I might eventually discover what he'd done. I called Susan Reyes that same afternoon, and we accelerated everything, filing the necessary legal documentation to freeze the relevant accounts before Brian could move anything further, while also finalizing something I had been carefully preparing for over a year, something that would become the centerpiece of the moment everything finally came together. I had updated my own will and established a comprehensive trust, with Susan's careful guidance, that not only protected all of Walter's actual wealth going forward but also included very specific, very deliberate provisions addressing exactly what had happened with Brian's theft, provisions designed to be revealed in a single, undeniable moment. I called a family meeting, telling my children only that my lawyer needed to go over some important paperwork regarding my estate planning, language vague enough not to raise alarm, but official enough that nobody questioned attending. Brian arrived looking slightly nervous but composed. Carol arrived already knowing partially what was coming. Tommy arrived completely in the dark, cheerful and relaxed, having no idea his entire understanding of our family's financial situation was about to be shattered. We sat in Susan's conference room, and she began by calmly explaining that she needed to review the full scope of the estate, including, she said, looking directly at Brian, certain accounts that were not properly disclosed during the original estate process 6 years ago. I watched Brian's face go pale in real time. Susan continued, professional and unwavering, laying out exactly what Richard had originally discovered, exactly what Brian had transferred into his own accounts, exactly what portion had been shared with Carol, exactly what the current frozen account balances reflected, and exactly what legal consequences Brian was now facing, including potential criminal charges for elder financial exploitation, a crime that carries serious legal weight specifically because it targets vulnerable family members during periods of grief. Tommy sat there, mouth literally open, looking between Brian and me, completely blindsided. "Mom, you've had $2 million this entire time. We've been bringing you groceries. I've been paying for your dinners because I thought you couldn't afford it." I looked at my youngest son, and for the first time in 6 years, I let myself feel the full weight of what this deception had cost, not just financially, but emotionally. The genuine kindness Tommy had shown me, kindness built on a lie his own brother had constructed. "I know, sweetheart," I said gently, "and I'm sorry you were kept in the dark too. But I needed to understand exactly what was happening before I said anything, because some lies, once you start pulling at them, reveal far more than you initially expect." Brian finally spoke, voice shaking. "Mom, I can explain. I was going to pay it back. I just needed time. The business needed capital, and I knew eventually." "Stop," I said, and something in my voice silenced him immediately. "You let me believe I was poor, Brian. You let me clip coupons and accept pity from strangers and worry about heating bills, while you used my husband's money he worked 30 years to build, to fund private schools and a house you couldn't actually afford on your own income. You did this while I was grieving the loss of my husband of 41 years. There is no explanation that makes that acceptable. I want to tell you what happened next, the part that I think of as the true ending of this story, the moment that mattered most to me, more than any legal consequence, more than any return money. I told my family, sitting in that conference room, that I was not pressing criminal charges against Brian, despite Susan's advice that I would have a strong case. I told them this decision had nothing to do with forgiveness and everything to do with protecting my grandchildren from watching their father go through a criminal trial. But I told Brian, clearly and permanently, that he was being formally removed as a beneficiary from any portion of my estate or Walter's remaining accounts, with the full amount he'd stolen, plus appropriate interest, legally required to be repaid over the following 5 years through a structured agreement Susan had drafted, enforceable through civil court if necessary. The portion of the estate originally designated for Brian would instead be redistributed equally between Tommy, Carol, and a newly established trust for my grandchildren's education, ensuring the money Walter had worked so hard to build would actually benefit the family the way he'd always intended, rather than disappearing into one son's deception. Carol, to her credit, insisted on repaying her portion of the misappropriated funds immediately, even though I told her it wasn't necessary given how she'd been manipulated into believing the arrangement was legitimate. "Mom, I should have asked harder questions," she said. "I want to make this right, even if it takes me years." It's been 3 weeks now since that meeting in Susan's office. Brian and I are not currently speaking, though Susan tells me the repayment arrangement is proceeding as legally required. Carol and I are slowly rebuilding something, carefully, honestly, in a way that feels more genuine than our relationship had felt in years. And Tommy, my sweet, blind-sided Tommy, has become, surprisingly, the family member I've grown closest to throughout this entire ordeal, partly because his shock and anger on my behalf were so completely genuine, so free of any complicated guilt or self-interest. If there's one thing I want you to understand from my story, it's this. Sometimes the people closest to you will count on your grief, your trust, your unwillingness to question them as the very tools they use to take advantage of you. And sometimes the wisest thing you can do isn't to confront that betrayal the moment you suspect it, but to quietly, carefully gather the truth and let people reveal exactly who they are before you decide what justice actually looks like.